Lee Van Cleef hated him more than anyone. But before the rivalries and the legends, there was a man, born on January 9, 1925, in Somerville, New Jersey, who would go on to redefine what it meant to play the villain. For over 5 decades, Lee Van Cleef carved out a place in cinema history, his piercing eyes and razor-sharp features making him one of the most iconic faces in westerns. He wasn't just an actor, he was the embodiment of menace. But Van Cleef's life was never just about playing the bad guy. It was a story of discipline, reinvention, and sheer perseverance. Growing up in small-town Somerville, he learned early the value of precision from his father, a watchmaker. That lesson, attention to detail, patience, and craft, would later shape the way he approached every role. When World War II erupted, Van Cleef served his country as a Navy radio operator. He saw combat. He faced danger head-on. And those experiences hardened him, giving his performances an authenticity no script could ever teach. His eyes carried the weight of a man who had truly lived through conflict. After the war, he briefly pursued engineering at the University of South Carolina. But destiny had other plans. Hollywood was calling. Van Cleef packed his bags, determined to try his luck in the world of acting. The early years weren't glamorous. He scraped by with small, uncredited roles, soldiers, cowboys, nameless henchmen. Then, in 1952, came High Noon. He had no lines, just a silent role as a cold, watchful gunman. But his presence was undeniable. Those sharp cheekbones, those steel-like eyes, they spoke louder than dialogue ever could. Hollywood began to notice. Directors saw in him the perfect antagonist, the man who could embody cruelty, ruthlessness, and danger with just a glance. And when Sergio Leone, master of the spaghetti western, brought him into his circle, Lee Van Cleef's career ignited. From then on, he wasn't just playing villains. He was defining them. The outlaw, the gunslinger, the man you feared was waiting for you at the other end of a dusty street. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, Lee Van Cleef paid his dues the hard way. He appeared in countless films and television shows, often slipping by unnoticed in small, uncredited roles. Bit by bit, he earned a reputation as a reliable character actor. But despite the steady work, his career seemed trapped in a box. Hollywood saw him only one way, the villain. Cold, one-dimensional, forgettable. Breaking out of that mold proved nearly impossible. Life didn't make it easier. A devastating car accident left him with lingering health problems, slowing down the momentum he had fought so hard to build. For a while, it seemed his career might fade into obscurity. And then came the moment that changed everything. In 1966, Sergio Leone cast Van Cleef as the merciless gunslinger, Angel Eyes in the good, the bad, and the ugly. Clint Eastwood may have been the star as the man with no name, but it was Van Cleef who burned himself into cinematic history. His Angel Eyes was more than just another villain. He was cold precision wrapped in human form, a bounty hunter whose chilling intensity stole scenes with nothing more than a stare. Audiences couldn't forget him. Those knife-sharp cheekbones, that angular face, those piercing eyes, he wasn't just playing the villain, he was the villain. And suddenly, the man Hollywood had once overlooked was impossible to ignore. The breakthrough opened the door to a string of unforgettable performances. In For a Few Dollars More, 1965, he embodied the cunning Colonel Douglas Mortimer, a man whose intelligence and quiet menace rivaled Eastwood's own presence. In The Big Gun Down, 1966, he shifted gears, playing a lawman-turned-hunter with an iron will. What set Van Cleef apart was that he never settled for playing cardboard cutouts. His villains carried weight, depth, and a strange kind of honor. Even when he was the outlaw, there was a code beneath the cruelty. In films like Death Rides a Horse, 1967, and Day of Anger, 1967, he stepped into the boots of aging gunslingers, men hardened by time and violence but softened by wisdom and regret. They weren't just criminals or killers. They were tragic figures, haunted and human. With every role, Lee Van Cleef reshaped the very idea of a Western villain. He proved that even the darkest characters could hold dignity, complexity, and power. Lee Van Cleef's greatest strength as an actor was his ability to balance menace with vulnerability. On screen, he could be the cold-blooded outlaw one moment and a haunted, weary soul the next. That duality made him not just a convincing villain, but a compelling presence audiences couldn't look away from. Though forever etched into history as a Western icon, Van Cleef's talent was never limited to one genre. By the 1970s and 1980s, he was reinventing himself for a new era, stepping beyond dusty frontier towns and into modern action films and television. His gravel-edged voice and commanding presence made him unforgettable in roles like Hawk in Escape from New York, 1981, where he played opposite Kurt Russell, and In the Octagon, 1980, holding his own alongside martial arts legend Chuck Norris. These films introduced Van Cleef to a younger generation of fans and proved that his appeal reached far beyond the saloons and deserts of the Old West. Television also welcomed him with open arms. In the 1984 series The Master, Van Cleef took on the role of a seasoned martial arts master, guiding a younger protege played by Timothy Van Patten. The series brought him into living rooms across America, cementing his reputation as a versatile performer who could shift from hardened gunfighter to mentor without missing a beat. Behind the camera, however, his life told a quieter, more complicated story. Lee Van Cleef's personal world was marked by both devotion and difficulty. His first marriage, to Patsy Ruth Cale in 1943, came when he was still little more than a boy, barely out of his teens, balancing the weight of family with the uncertainty of a career, still struggling to take shape. Together, they raised 3 children, David, Alan, and Deborah. But life as an actor was never easy on families. Hollywood demanded long absences, irregular hours, and a constant pull between home and career. The strain took its toll, and after 15 years of marriage, Lee and Patsy parted ways in 1958. For Lee Van Cleef, the years after his first divorce were turbulent. His career had begun to stall, and the personal upheaval only added to the uncertainty. But in 1960, he turned a new page, marrying Joan Marjorie Drain. Their relationship unfolded during one of the most transformative chapters of his career. At first, life tested him harshly. A near-fatal car accident threatened to derail everything, leaving him with lasting injuries and forcing him into a hiatus. Yet fate had other plans. In 1965, Sergio Leone cast him in for a few dollars more, a role that didn't just revive Van Cleef's career, it reinvented it. Practically overnight, he was no longer just a dependable supporting actor, but an international star. Through this meteoric rise, Joan stood beside him, witnessing his evolution from Hollywood's reliable villain to one of the genre's defining figures. But the pressures of fame and the strain of the lifestyle proved heavy. After 14 years together, the marriage ended in 1974. 2 years later, in 1976, Van Cleef married Barbara Havalone, the woman who would remain with him until the end of his life. With Barbara, he found the stability he had been missing, even as his health began to decline. Heart problems and lingering complications from his accident shadowed his later years, but he continued to work steadily through the 1970s and 1980s, determined to remain in the craft he loved. Barbara was by his side through it all, his anchor as he transitioned from stardom to the quieter twilight of his career. When Van Cleef passed away in 1989 from a heart attack, Barbara survived him, closing the chapter on a 13-year marriage defined not by spectacle, but by resilience and devotion. His personal life was also marked by a story that revealed the other side of the man often typecast as ruthless on screen. While building a playhouse for his daughter Deborah, Van Cleef accidentally severed the last joint of his right-hand middle finger. For many, it might have been a disfiguring tragedy. For Van Cleef, it became part of his legend. That missing fingertip only deepened his rugged image, a small scar that reflected both the devoted father at home and the hardened gunslinger audiences admired on screen. Audiences rarely noticed the missing joint on Lee Van Cleef's hand. He had mastered the art of concealing it on screen, turning what could have been a distraction into a subtle detail woven into his persona. But to those who worked closely with him, the injury was unmistakable, a physical reminder of the sacrifices he had made as both an actor and a father. The accident required medical care and recovery, yet Van Cleef refused to let it derail his career. His resilience and determination kept him in Hollywood, proving his dedication to the craft and to the life he had built for his family. Beyond his personal battles, Van Cleef carried another burden, a simmering animosity toward one of Hollywood's biggest stars, John Wayne. Their relationship was anything but friendly. To outsiders, it seemed odd that two icons of the same genre could harbor such bitterness. But beneath the surface, the disdain ran deep, shaped by clashing personalities, opposing values, and very different visions of what it meant to be an actor. Van Cleef, with his sharp features and menacing screen presence, thrived on complexity. He approached his roles with the discipline of a method actor, immersing himself fully into the morally ambiguous characters that defined him. His performances were layered, subtle, and rooted in authenticity. John Wayne, by contrast, was Hollywood's enduring cowboy archetype, the patriotic, larger-than-life hero who embodied stoic masculinity. Wayne often played variations of the same character, a formula that made him beloved by audiences, but, in Van Cleef's eyes, exposed a lack of depth. To Van Cleef, Wayne symbolized the complacency of the Hollywood system, a man who relied on persona rather than range, who leaned on image rather than exploration. The two men's differences went far beyond acting styles. They reflected opposite approaches to life and art. Their feud became the stuff of Hollywood legend, a rivalry that stretched across years and cast a long shadow over their career. The divide between Lee Van Cleef and John Wayne was not only professional, it was political. John Wayne was famously outspoken in his beliefs, a staunch conservative who championed right-wing causes and American nationalism. He openly supported the Vietnam War, becoming a public advocate for traditional American values at a time when the country was undergoing massive cultural change in the 1960s and 70s. To many, Wayne was not just an actor, he was the embodiment of old-school patriotism, both on and off the screen. Van Cleef, by contrast, carried himself with more restraint when it came to politics, but those close to him knew he leaned toward progressive ideals. He was sympathetic to the counterculture movement that questioned American imperialism and rejected the rigid traditions Wayne so proudly defended. Noted. To Van Cleef, Wayne's constant political posturing felt hollow, an extension of the same unyielding, self-righteous cowboy roles he played on screen. Where Wayne saw loyalty to a moral code, Van Cleef saw inflexibility, even arrogance, and it only deepened his distaste. Their political opposition layered yet another level of hostility onto an already strained relationship. But the rift wasn't only about ideology, it was about power, fame, and recognition. John Wayne had reached superstardom early and never let it slip. He was adored by audiences, hailed as an American hero, and enjoyed immense control over his projects. Few actors in Hollywood wielded that kind of influence. Van Cleef's path, however, was far rockier. For years he was relegated to supporting roles, often playing one-dimensional villains while actors like Wayne claimed the spotlight. It wasn't until Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns in the 1960s for a few dollars more and the good, the bad, and the ugly that Van Cleef was finally elevated to leading man status. Yet even then, his fame never matched Wayne's. The imbalance gnawed at him. Hollywood, dominated by towering stars like Wayne, had long pigeonholed Van Cleef, and he deeply resented how the industry seemed rigged against actors outside its chosen few. Off-camera, their personal interactions only fueled the fire. The tension between the two wasn't just professional rivalry, it was personal animosity sharpened over years of differences in values, careers, and egos. Lee Van Cleef often found John Wayne insufferable, pompous, domineering, and larger than life in all the wrong ways. Wayne's towering persona wasn't confined to the screen. It carried into Hollywood itself, where he was notorious for throwing his weight around, demanding control, and insisting that things be done on his terms. For Van Cleef, a man who was naturally reserved and private, this kind of brash arrogance was unbearable. He avoided social events where Wayne would hold court, preferring distance over confrontation. On the rare occasions when the two did cross paths, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Wayne reportedly dismissed Van Cleef as nothing more than a dependable villain, a supporting actor who could sneer and scowl with conviction, but who lacked the star power or magnetism to ever carry a film. This attitude infuriated Van Cleef, who believed that Wayne's legendary status was built less on talent and more on circumstance, on timing, image, and luck. Their professional rivalry was sharpened by the fact that both men were shaping the very same genre. Westerns dominated the box office, but they were not all cut from the same cloth. John Wayne embodied the classic Hollywood Western, where the line between hero and villain was bright and simple. His films, like The Searchers and True Grit, painted the American frontier in bold, patriotic strokes. Van Cleef, however, found his footing in the spaghetti westerns of Sergio Leone, a world of grit, moral ambiguity, and characters who lived in the gray. His work In for a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly stood in direct contrast to Wayne's polished heroes, presenting audiences with outlaws and lawmen who were far more complex and far more human. To Van Cleef, this wasn't just a stylistic difference, it was ideological. He believed Wayne's brand of westerns glossed over the messy truths of history, offering a sanitized vision of frontier justice that propped up outdated ideals of American exceptionalism. In contrast, Van Cleef's characters embraced the darker, conflicted realities of survival and morality. That philosophical divide fueled his disdain. To him, Wayne was not just a rival, he was the embodiment of everything shallow and hollow in Hollywood. Their feud, then, was never about a single insult or a role lost to the other. It was a collision of values, careers, and egos. Wayne stood as the unshakable symbol of the old guard, while Van Cleef fought his way to prominence through reinvention, resilience, and a willingness to dive into roles that were raw and unpolished. The bitterness never faded, and their enmity became part of Hollywood's own folklore, an unspoken rivalry that colored how each man was remembered. Leah Van Cleef's story came to an end on December 16, 1989, when he died of a heart attack at the age of 64. His death marked the closing of a chapter in Western cinema, as one of its most unforgettable icons faded from the stage. Yet, even in passing, his presence has never left. His work continues to inspire filmmakers, critics, and audiences, standing as a benchmark of what a truly great screen villain or anti-hero can be. Van Cleef redefined the role of the Western antagonist. He gave villains depth, charisma, and humanity, transforming them into characters that audiences could admire, fear, and even sympathize with. His performances in films like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly remain etched in cinematic history, proof of his unmatched ability to blend menace with charm and subtlety with power. More than 3 decades after his passing, Lee Van Cleef's legacy endures. His career was a masterclass in reinvention and dedication, his characters unforgettable, his influence undeniable. He was and will always be a towering figure in the world of film, a man who turned the shadows of the Western into something unforgettable.